Stonington Jane Doe, identified as Linda Childers. We begin here in May of 1974, between Stonington and Ledyard, Connecticut. It was here, in between trees in a wooded area, that our Jane Doe was discovered. A tip had come into the police suggesting there were graves behind a home. They would investigate and discover that was unfortunately true. There were 2 shallow graves a few hundred feet behind the house that had been identified in the tip. Inside were the remains of a man and a woman, and their names came pretty quickly. The man and woman were identified as Dirk and Lorraine Stahl, except that they weren't. They would eventually realize that Dirk Stahl was an alias, and he was actually Gustavius Lee Carmichael, who had already done time for robbing multiple banks. In fact, he was supposed to be still in prison at that moment, and he had escaped and not been found. Not surprisingly, Lorraine Stahl was also an alias. But the alias of who was the question. She had been small in stature and likely between 18 and 30. Both individuals were determined to have passed due to wounds to the head and chest. The tip was called in by the common-law wife of a man who had lived in the home that they were found behind. The tip said that Richard DeFreitas and Donald Brandt were responsible. The man was identified by dental records as an escaped prisoner. It would turn out he and another prisoner had actually escaped from a U.S. Marshal who was moving him from a Massachusetts prison to federal court in Hartford, Connecticut. Those 2 men would repeat what Carmichael knew best, holding up a bank in New Jersey. There are a lot of safety measures in place now so that not much money can generally be taken from a bank, but on October 5th, 1970, that wasn't the case. They managed to get $60,000, which, while still a lot of money today, was an incredible amount of money then. Today, that would mean the buying power of $1.5 million. The 2 men, with our Jane Doe, would appear at the home of Richard DeFreitas and his common-law wife. But even she and DeFreitas were using fake names. They were actually Ray and Joanne Emerson. Shortly after this, Ray Emerson, also known as Ray DeFreitas, would rob a bank himself along with Brandt and a man named James Gardner. These 3 men, along with Carmichael and our Jane Doe, were in a room together when the 3 from the most recent robbery would split the $30,000 cash haul they got from that one 3 ways. $30,000 would be worth $760,000 today. They would pledge that they are partners and they would take care of each other, stating when one of the 3 committed a crime, they would split it out 3 ways, even if they weren't present. And they had their fingers in a lot of illegal activities. They even rented apartments through the town that would help harbor criminals who were living there under false names. It was this harboring of others that would end badly. Carmichael and our Jane Doe had shown up seeking a place to hide out and the purchase of a false identity. It was DeFreitas who had sold them the papers, and this was when they became Dirk and Lorraine Stahl. Their identities were stolen from someone DeFreitas had met once. So under the Stahl identities, the woman would open up a bank account, and the couple would move into a home that they rented. Along the way, they became friendly with Richard DeFreitas and his common-law wife. It was here that our Jane Doe expressed to the wife that she was concerned about the life she was living. She was especially afraid of being arrested, and she would mention that she was concerned about what she would need to say to the police if that were to happen. The common-law wife would then relay this to DeFreitas. This one statement would change everything for our Jane Doe. DeFreitas quickly contacted his partner, Donald Brandt. They decided to permanently make sure that our Jane Doe couldn't rat them out to the police. And they decided that Carmichael had to go also, as he had feelings for his girlfriend, and they didn't know what he would do. The 2 men would carry out their plans after luring the couple to the land behind his house. DeFreitas would pick up his wife and James Gardner and tell them what he'd done, saying he was afraid she would implicate them in crimes. Gardner then assisted the 2 men in burying them. The wife of DeFreitas was horrified after what happened because Jane Doe confided in her. She went ahead and turned the group in. Gardner and DeFreitas would eventually be convicted, with Gardner testifying against them. But the one thing that was left unsolved was who was our Jane Doe. When she was recovered, she did have items of clothing and jewelry, and there was a school ring with the letters J, H, S, and N monogrammed with the letters ILN and the date 1917. But of course, the date was 53 years in the past, so it may have been a family ring that had meaning. The other that she wore was an inexpensive imitation emerald ring. Additionally, she was wearing a wood-carved brooch. She had a tan leather wet-look vest, a gold or tan sweater, and a brown tweed skirt, along with a pair of boots. They knew a lot about her existence and what had been going on, but it was all tied to those fake names. She had been seen around town in a green 1964 Oldsmobile, which may or may not have looked like what you see on the screen here, with either Massachusetts or Maine plates. They began looking and then found it dumped in Hartford, Connecticut. Inside that car was a yellow raincoat that she used to wear, as well as Clairol brand hair roller set. It's not clear who the car was registered to, but it does appear she had been using the name Connie before becoming Lorraine Stahl. They knew of her, but nothing of her real name. It would eventually go cold, and they did put some sketches out on the news, but no tips came in. They still did not know what her name was. She would end up being entered into the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, where her information would reside until March of 2024. Thanks to Othram Labs, we now know Linda Childers was just 24 when her life was taken. What hits me with this case is that she was questioning her life choices, and she didn't get a chance to change her circumstances. It's one of the rare times, too, that the person who committed the crime was actually punished while leaving behind unnamed victims. It seems like so often, leaving someone nameless usually shields the perpetrator from having to pay for his crime. But pay they did. James Gardner and Joanne Ranello, who I've referred to as the common-law wife, both were given immunity for testifying. However, during the trial, some friends were called as witnesses to allege that Gardner was involved, and Ranello was the one who lured our Jane Doe to the spot where it happened, which I found in a lawsuit involving this case that ended up at the Supreme Court in 1980. I'll provide a link to the case in the description below this video. It's pretty interesting, and it's why I had so much information. The tale was twisted, and those involved pointed fingers at each other. The witnesses were others who were already incarcerated, all friends and acquaintances. One witness testified that he spoke to Joanne Ranello, the common-law wife, in the visiting room of the Adult Correction Institute in Rhode Island, and Richard Freitas was present, claiming she told him she feared another man named Robichaud because she had participated in the crime with him and Gardner. This would implicate the two people who in the end received immunity, but it's not clear who was telling the truth. It's possible the point was simply to introduce doubt and that it wasn't true, but it's interesting if Ranello was actually visiting her former spouse in jail, which I'm sure they could verify but was not in the document I saw. The first witness in this case had been a friend of Gardner, one of the two individuals who received immunity for testifying. That man was a close friend of them and was even the best man at Gardner's wedding. He testified about a conversation they had, and the state stopped this line of questions, telling him he was called to the stand to provide testimony claiming that Gardner showed up with this witness, his best friend, to provide a hit for him and take care of Carmichael. But later, when he followed up with his friend, the request was withdrawn, saying it's been taken care of. It's very convenient and twisty that all these men knew each other from going in and out of the prison system. It's really hard to know what's true. They would say it was hearsay, but it does point fingers at someone else. Another witness, Richard Devlin, testified without the jury present. He was trying to testify that he had served time with both Carmichael and a man named Robichaud, saying Robichaud told him he and a man named Jimmy killed Carmichael, without any mention of our Jane Doe. This witness, if he could even be called that, couldn't provide corroboration because Robichaud had already passed away. This testimony would end up being suppressed from the jury, and in my opinion of what was mentioned, probably the least credible as far as bringing in new and convenient people to blame. And of course, the couple was found behind DeFreitas and Ranello's home. It was the issue of these two witnesses and their testimony that would lead this case to one of the very few that actually wind their way up to the Supreme Court. There were 5 third-party declarations in total pointing to other people, and all 5 were withheld from the jury. The only other testimony I found interesting enough to present here is that DeFreitas claimed he would never shoot anyone with a gun. He would only pull one out in order to threaten and scare someone, which is an interesting defense. I nearly left out the trial, but rarely do we get to see people paying for what they did. although nothing ever seems enough when you take away someone's name as well as their life. In this case, DeFreitas lost the case before the Supreme Court, in part because the defense had other options to include the witnesses. They could have got them in a different way. And as a result, he failed to get his trial overturned. It appears justice was served at least as much as it could be. Before we move on to who she was, I'd like to know what you guys think about who was responsible. So, of course, all this leads us back to who was our Jane Doe. They were able to check a telephone company bill listing, which showed calls to Nashville, Tennessee, multiple towns in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York City, and Buffalo, New York. They knew that our Jane Doe had made the calls, and they were trying to tie her to these towns. But in the end, the truth would be that 24-year-old Linda Childers came from Kentucky. But she did have relatives in Tennessee. Not much has been released about Linda, but they have said she had a young daughter. It's hard not to feel for her daughter, whose DNA would then give her mom back her name. Hopefully she grew up in a loving home. Linda Sue Childers went unidentified for 49 years. Had she lived, she would be 73 years old today. Huge thanks for watching all the way to the end, and a big thanks to all of you who consistently like and comment on the videos. The whole dance with YouTube is hard sometimes. Whether you leave a full comment or an emoji, it makes a huge difference. It's a huge push toward the videos being suggested to new people. The next goal is 20,000. Thanks everyone for watching. Take care of yourselves and each other.